The starting point for our patio planter are making the 4 corner posts of the main box. And like we've already discussed, we're starting with construction lumber. It's really nice because the pieces already exist, don't have to glue anything up. However, construction lumber does have a few downsides. Depending on how long it's been sitting around the home center or lumber yard, it can be kind of beat up on some of the faces. Plus it has that rounded over edge that makes it easy to work with outside, but not so attractive in a nice looking piece of patio furniture. So what we're going to do is create our posts out of some cedar 4x4s. Now, in order to clean up the faces, what we're going to do is make a couple of cuts here at the table saw to get things started. So I've taken a long cedar 4x4, lopped it off into some blanks that I'll create the posts from. Then we'll make 2 cuts. And you can see that I've laid out the location of where those cuts are going to be. Now, the posts are going to finish at around 2 inches square. So I've raised the table saw blade to about 2 1/8 inch. Then I'm going to make the cuts by having the leg be on the outside of the blade. That way I'll make 1 pass, then I can flip the blank over, make a second pass, which frees the leg. What I don't want to do is end up with the leg or the post trapped between the blade and the rip fence where it could come kicking back at me. So this is going to be a safe way to start making our posts. The end panels and the front and back panels on the planter are captured in grooves that get cut on the inside faces of the 4 posts. To do that, we're going to use a dado blade rather than a single blade. And while the dado blade can't cut a groove wide enough in a single pass, we can do it in 2 passes. So what I've done is installed the dado blade and set it up so that it's just slightly off center on the thickness of the post. That way I can make a 1 pass, then turn the piece around, make a second pass, which widens the groove just a little bit and also perfectly centers it. And I can make adjustments to the rip fence until that groove matches the thickness of the parts for the panels. It's a pretty simple process and is a good way to add some strength to this assembly. We're using screws to cinch the panels tight to the posts. So our next step is to drill clearance holes for those screws right down the center of the grooves in the posts. Now that presents a couple of challenges. First, 3 holes in each groove, 6 holes per post. That ends up being a lot of holes. And that could get kind of confusing with the layout. The other thing is that we don't want those screw holes to be in the exact location. They're offset vertically so that they're not going to interfere with each other. Now to keep things a little bit more organized and speed up the process, I'm using a couple of stop blocks here on the drill press. I've positioned one on one end that will drill a hole that's 2 inches from the end. On the opposite side of the fence, I have another stop block set up 3 1/8 inch from the end of the post. Then there's also a center hole. Now I don't have room for a 3rd stop block in here, but what I can do is put in a spacer block which matches the spacing between the 2 holes from the center points. So I can slip that in place and drill the center hole on each face. It sounds a little complicated, but once you start doing it, you'll realize that this can really speed up the efficiency and accuracy of the work you do at the drill press. Now before we get into assembling the end panels and the front and back panel, there's one thing that I want to do first, and that's to make a decorative cutout along the lower edge of the front panel. Now to make this a little easier, I'm doing it on the single board before it even gets glued up. To do it, I'm just creating a pattern out of some 1/4 inch plywood. Then I can trace that on each end of this lower rail. And then I also drew it in on the back side as well, because sometimes you have to flip pieces around when you're cutting at the bandsaw. Then you can connect the dots along the front here to be able to create that nice smooth surface. If you're doing a lot of these, you can clean it up with a router, but what I'm going to do after bandsawing it is head back over to the bench and just use some files and sandpaper. All right, with this lower rail rough cut on the bandsaw, it's time to do a little smoothing. And here you kind of have to balance how much smoothing you want to do with your coefficient of fussiness. So for an outdoor project like this, most people are going to see it from a distance and not up close. So I'm just going to use a file to clean up things and concentrate mostly on this outside show face. So what I'll do first is to take a half round file and file a slight chamfer on the front edge. This kind of helps even out the saw marks already, but more importantly, as I take strokes with the file across the grain, I'm less likely to get chip out that's going to look a little unsightly. Then I'm going to use the half round side of the file to clean up this concave curve. And then I'll use the flat face of the file as I go around the convex portion. I like to feel the surface, because if it feels smooth and even, then it is, and you don't have to go looking for trouble. Now for this long straight part, it was tough to make that at the bandsaw. So again, I'll find where any of the lumps and bumps are, and then I'm going to use a block plane and just take some passes to hit those high parts. Once it looks straight, then I can just leave it and I'm ready to start gluing up my panel. Since this is going to be the front, I chose the 3 best looking boards, it's subjective, to be this panel, and I'm ready to glue it up. The key thing here, this thing's going to live outside, so you want to use a waterproof glue. Now you can use epoxy, but I like a water-based waterproof glue. It's just easier to apply for me and gives me really good results. So I can spread a bead of glue on one surface, put the 2 pieces together, rub them back and forth, kind of like a rub joint. And that spreads out the glue. Then it's time to bring in the clamps. All right, unlike some more complicated furniture projects, going from panels and posts to a fully assembled planter box is pretty simple here. And that's because we're going to be using screws. So what I have is the end panel, and it just drops into the grooves in the posts. There are really only 2 things that you need to consider here. The first is to make sure that your surfaces, the ends and edges, are flush. The other is when you're putting the posts on, you want to orient the posts so that you have the same hole pattern on the ends and then naturally on the faces once you put those in. From there, I'm going to use the clearance holes that I drilled earlier as a guide for drilling pilot holes. To do the assembly, I'm using these long construction screws. They bite into the soft cedar really well, and they have a big wide washer head that helps hold everything together. Now if you want to and you feel better about it, you can put glue in the grooves and put everything together, but the screws are doing the lion's share of the work here. So once the 2 end assemblies are done, the procedure for assembling the front and back is about the same. You'll bring those into place, set them into the grooves, and then since everything is getting a little bit larger here, I added a couple of clamps just to hold everything together. And it's just a matter of drilling the pilot holes and then the screws, and we have ourselves a planter box. There's a little housekeeping to take care of on the inside of the planter box before we wrap this up. The first step is to attach a pair of cleats near the bottom edge. I have it upside down here just because it's easier to get at. That allows me to flip this over now. And we can install a big pile of slats on the inside. Now, these slats provide drainage, but then support the planter boxes that are on the inside. Now, there's a slat that gets installed flush at each end. Then to evenly space them, just like we did over at the drill press, I made a couple of plywood spacer blocks. So I can set those in place in between and now fit the slats in place and attach them with screws. It's a good idea to have your slats all pre-drilled before you get started here. Just makes the process go a little smoother. You get the idea here. You're just going to step your way down until you have all the slats in place. A little bit of mitered molding really dresses up the top edge of this planter. The nice thing is that this molding overlaps both the front and the inside edges, so you don't have to be real precise. Now, I cut these pieces over at the miter saw, setting up a couple of stops so that I know that my two short end pieces are going to be exactly the same length, as well as the front and back pieces. Now, you could leave the planter just as it is. It's designed to hold these square pots and could help make your backyard or patio even better than it already is. Heck, you could even put a big long pot in here, fill it with ice, and be ready for your next outdoor gathering. But you can dress this planter up even more by adding a custom trellis.
Well, it's time for the fun part of this project. And the fun part is going to be making the copper supports that have a twist to them. And we do this by creating a simple wooden die in which we'll press the copper to its final shape. The die consists of an inner board which is 1/2-inch plywood. Now, as you can see here, I've drawn the shape that I want, and I'm going to bandsaw that out. Now, we can't just do a single bandsaw cut. Here's why. I need my die to come together fully with the 3/8 tubing in between. A single bandsaw cut will open things up adequately up at the top crown of each of these round points, but as you can see, it's going to be a tight squeeze here on the sides and it'll crush the tubing. So it's important that we lay out the full width of the tubing and fully cut out all of it. Now, once I have this cut out, I'm going to take one side of this die and I'll glue and screw it to a piece of plywood. The other piece of plywood, like you see here, will go on top of that, and that will form essentially a sheath in which we can insert the copper tubing and the mating piece of our die. Once that's done, we'll clamp everything together and we'll form the attractive curved plant supports with a twist. So, off to the bandsaw. I've started assembling the die. As you can see here, I've screwed and glued a piece of 1/4-inch plywood to 1/2 of the piece that we just cut out at the bandsaw. So what I'm going to do now to finish this up is screw and glue the top half on, and when I'm done with that, we're going to be ready to roll out some copper and form the twisted trellis supports. All right, then it's time to start forming copper. I have some pieces of copper tubing cut at 54 inches. Now, I'm going to take a little paste wax and I want to lubricate my form. And I'm doing that because as the copper is drawn into the shape, it's going to slide across this form. And the wax just makes it a little bit easier. I'll place the tubing in between these 1/4-inch plywood panels, and I want to make sure it's even side to side. So the other side of the die is in place. And now I'm going to gently apply pressure with my clamps. I'll keep needing to reset the clamps and gently working my way along back and forth until everything is fully set. And there we go, a finished copper trellis support. So 6 more of these, and Logan will be ready to make the frame that supports it all.
So now that the guys have the planter box done and the copper bent, we can go ahead and work on the trellis. The trellis starts with these 2 uprights. To connect them to the box, we're going to cut a notch on one end. Now you can do this at the table saw, but what happens if you don't have a table saw? Well, you can cut this notch by hand or with a circular saw. So what we're going to do is use a guide to create a square cut across the top where the notch starts. Then I'll set the guide off to the side and we'll just make a series of curves along the notch. Then we'll come back with a hammer and a wide chisel and clean those up. Okay, so now that we have those notches cut, we can concentrate on the guts of the trellis. The first thing we need to do here is to grab our cross members. And I've already marked these out. We need to drill holes in these for the copper squiggles that Chris made. So you can see I've started the layout process, and then I just come in with an awl, make that center point. Now with all those marked, I'm going to grab a drill, and we'll drill all the way down until I hit the stop color. We're going to do that in each of these hole locations. Once I have that all done, I'll swap this out for a thinner bit, because then on the bottom cross member, we're going to have to drill a through hole centered in that hole we just drilled. And that's simply a weep hole. That way, if water gets down into it, it will drain out the bottom. Okay, so now that we have all of our holes drilled for the copper, I've went ahead and pre-drilled the larger hole for the leg screws that we'll use to hold this assembly together. So now really all we have left to do is install the copper, clamp everything together, finish our pre-drilling for the threaded part of the leg screws. And I'll do that in all 4 corners and then drive those leg screws home. Now we can bring all of the parts for the trellis together. So we have this internal assembly that we just ended up screwing together. We have our posts that have our notches on them. And then we have a top piece. And this top piece has a decorative curve on it. And that's easy to cut at the bandsaw, and then you can smooth it out with a drum sander in the drill press. So now it's just a matter of screwing everything together. I went ahead and used a couple spacers to raise up this center assembly to give the right reveal in relation to the outside posts. We'll pre-drill the holes and then drive the leg screws. There we go. Our trellis is all assembled, so now the only thing we have left to do is to bring the planter box back in here and get this mounted. Mounting the trellis onto the planter box is pretty straightforward. The first thing we need to do is trim this edging so those posts will fit over it. To do that, I held it up in place, marked the edges, and then I just used the pole saw to cut down the lines until I hit the face of the planter box. Then you can use the chisel and just knock away that waste. Then once you get the trellis up onto the planter box, you can hold it in place with a couple of clamps, and then pre-drill some holes from the inside. And then it's a simple matter of installing some leg screws. There we go. So now the planter and trellis is ready for an outdoor finish. After you've spent time building a project, whether it's an outdoor project like this or an inside project, you're going to want to make sure that your finish is up to the task of keeping it looking good for years to come. With an outdoor project, that's even more important because the wind, rain, and sun can really take a toll on a project like this. So we're going to choose a good outdoor finish for something like this garden planter and trellis. Now you could paint it, and that would be perfectly fine, and it would protect it. But I'm going to use a clear oil since we have a really nice cedar here. The outdoor oil is going to help protect it against some UV rays and water and insects. Now, whatever outdoor finish you choose, it is going to be important to note that you're going to have to maintain that finish for the years to come. So every couple of years, you're going to need to bring it inside, sand it down, and probably apply another coat of finish. And if you are in a climate that experiences winters, you'll do yourself a lot of favors by bringing it inside during those freezing months.
Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts, all fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.